What is FDA's latest software guidance for 510K submission? FDA does have new software guidance issued in June this year. On this segment of MedTech Crossroads, we're going to look at the newest FDA software guidance for pre-market submissions and look at a timely example of a medical device recall that shows why FDA is focused on software functions is appropriate. We'll also talk about what it all means for startup medtech companies. MedTech Crossroads is brought to you by Into your medical device development partner. Free learning from MedTech Crossroads will save you headaches on your medical device development journey. So let's get into this. Here, we're staring right at the new pre-market submissions for device software functions guidance document, hot off the press in June of this year. The draft was issued on November 4th of 2021. And what you'll notice about this document, just from looking at the index, there are certainly things that you're going to expect to see. How much documentation do you need? Software description, risk management file, software requirement specification, software and system architecture diagram, software design specification, development, configuration management, maintenance best practices, software testing as a part of verification and validation. Look, none of this stuff is really that unusual for software development or for medical device development. It's kind of the hybrid of what you would expect to see. What's expected out of the design controls process from FDA, including verification and validation? Cool. How does that merge with typical software development practices? Things that you don't see from most other parts of a medical device, like a software requirement specification, an architecture diagram, design specification of software specific. So if you just take those two things and merge them, you're going to see a lot that you're expecting to see. The intent here is to harmonize more and more with 62304, the international consensus standard. But keep in mind, things are a little bit split because FDA still has its own software lifecycle expectations. And this section here having to do with what you submit to them as a part of a pre-market submission. But I want you to look just at the title. I don't need anything more than the title right now. Content of pre-market submissions for device software functions. This has been a typical problem to get the industry to understand that at some level, there's nothing fundamentally different about software versus a hardware-based medical device, whether it includes electronics or not. It does something. There's an intended purpose to the device or to the software function. And what that function has to do allows you to characterize the risk associated with it. It allows you to identify what you should do to mitigate in the case of a failure relative to that function. And that's really what the focus is here. When you get down to the documentation sections of this document, they basically have, here's the definition of a device software function. It's a distinct purpose of the product, which could be the intended use or a subset of the intended use of the product. So just what we said a second ago. They define a whole bunch of other terms, and then they come to documentation level. Enhanced documentation should be provided for any pre-market submission that includes device software functions where a failure or a flaw of any device function could present a hazardous situation with a probable risk of death or serious injury. I tell you what, it's going to be pretty easy to fall within enhanced documentation. The more software there is, the more likely it is that you'll find yourself in enhanced documentation. And that's not the end of the world. We'll look in a second at what enhanced documentation includes. Basic documentation for anything that has device software functions, but enhanced documentation doesn't apply, so it's the fallback. The recommended documentation for the two levels, there's always going to be a documentation level evaluation to say which you are of these two levels, a description of the software, risk management file components, a software requirement specification, a software and system architecture design. But then here's where it gets interesting. The enhanced has a software design specification, but you don't need to submit that as a part of the pre-market submission if you're in the basic documentation level. But FDA wants to understand the technical design details of how the software functions as a part of the enhanced level of documentation. Software development, configuration management, and maintenance practices. You can make a summary, or you can make a declaration of conformity to certain parts of 62304. And that's an either or. But there's sort of a, they want to see the complete configuration management stuff as a part of enhanced documentation. What about testing? Software testing as a part of verification and validation. A summary description and protocols, including acceptance criteria. Did we just say that? Acceptance criteria. Can we all say that together, please? Acceptance criteria. If we're going to hear testing, I want to hear acceptance criteria in the same breath. Please, never, ever again, after hearing this segment, talk about testing if you're not talking about acceptance criteria. What are you testing? What's success and failure? What's pass-fail? For enhanced documentation level, basic documentation plus the protocols, the unit and integration test protocols. So if we look back at the left side, system level test protocols. But at the enhanced documentation level, both the unit and the integration level. Both require software version history and both require unresolved software anomalies to be documented as a part of this. There's a lot of great stuff in this guidance. We will not touch it all. It's a relatively long guidance. They go into detail about what needs to be included in these different things, which is really great because with software, so many times people are looking at it saying, what do I need to document? Here's how my coders work. This is what they do. I don't understand what FDA wants. Well, good news. They're actually starting to specify it. They're starting to just say, you know what? Here, you can do this. There are examples as a part of this document. But let's not stop with the guidance. I wanted to focus on the very basic title of the guidance, software functions, because so much of what you do with a medical device comes down to what are you saying it does? What is the function you're trying to get? Well, it turns out that this is exactly where failures come. They come at a function level. The function either does or doesn't happen. Technically, behind the scenes, it could be because of the software. It could be because of the electronics. It could be because of the hardware. It could be because of training. It could be because of labeling. There's so many ways that you can make the device work or not work, and a lot of those are implementation decisions. So let's look at a current example. Again, hot off the press, 3 days ago, Baxter Healthcare Corporation recalls Sigma Spectrum infusion pumps with master drug library for repeat upstream occlusion false alarms. Now, it's worth noting that this is not the first Class 1 recall. They identified this as a Class 1 recall, the most serious type of recall. It could cause serious injuries or death. Which type of software documentation do we think they need? Enhanced, right? Because if you can have failures of software that could create serious injury or death, you need enhanced documentation. Now that would have all, this device would have been cleared before that requirement came out, so that's just water under the bridge. But it points to the reason why FDA, I'm not saying Baxter is the reason why this came out, but it points to the reason why FDA is focusing on guidance like this. Because there are certain functions that if you don't pay enough attention to them in the documentation, in the testing, you're going to get failures. Now, it turns out this is the second failure of this system. Number 2, this is the second time it's failed. It turns out, and we'll get to this in the document, that false alarms were not their problem the first time. The first time the problem is that it was not alarming for upstream occlusions. So they did a Class 1 recall. They made software patches. They rolled them out. And for that function, this function, what's the function? What's the subset of the intended use? The function is we need to tell people if there's an upstream occlusion in our infusion pump. We got to tell people. Well, it wasn't always telling people. Sometimes it wasn't saying you have an occlusion. Oh boy, the flow is stopped, right? So they patched it, and now it's telling people too frequently that there's an occlusion, even when there's not an occlusion. So this infusion pump, and we're not singling Baxter out here, this is just an example for educational purposes, right? Public information here. I'm sure they're doing their best to get this thing all cleaned up. False alarms for upstream occlusion after pump software upgrades. Well, it turns out these pump software upgrades were to fix the previous Class 1 recall. Why are false occlusion alarms a problem? Well, clinician fatigue, alarm fatigue is a real thing. And if a doctor goes rushing in there to try to fix something and it turns out to be nothing, they could do damage simply by rushing in and doing something too quickly. But if they're having to run into room after room after room for false occlusion alarms, they're not going to be paying attention to the real problems that are out there. Unfortunately, there's not a solution for this until another software version is completed. So this will be not the version that got the first Class 1 recall, not the version that got the second Class 1 recall. This will be the version that hopefully fixes the problem. And they want users to report these things, that they're using these. But here's the thing that was the most interesting, right? The software versions the subject of this recall were created to address a previous Class 1 recall for the other versions that presented a risk of these pumps not alarming for repeated upstream occlusion events. So this is just an example. Again, we wish companies that end up in this position all the best. Obviously, it's not an enviable place to be, but it is instructional to us as a community to understand the type of documentation, the type of testing that FDA is now asking for as a part of their latest software guidance. There are reasons for it. They do see things like this in the marketplace. So what is FDA's latest software guidance? Well, you just saw it. It came out in June. The link will be in the description. And there are good reasons why they're doing it. Enhanced documentation, basic documentation, having to do with whether your software is capable of harming somebody or whether it just performs some functions that really, if they fail or go bad, it's not going to be the end of the world. But many of you who are doing software on your devices can expect enhanced documentation, which is going to have just a few more requirements like we saw earlier in the segment. If you like what you heard today, please like and subscribe to help us keep you. Let me try that again. If you like what you heard today, please like and subscribe to help us keep bringing you free MedTech education on MedTech Crossroads.